Yeah. Okay. It still may be a little bit loud. Yeah, I think it needs to go down a little bit. Don't y'all? There's too much of an echo. Echo, echo, echo. Okay, test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. It's still up. Still up. That doesn't mean that he is there for all times. Okay? What he's saying is, I'm going to pay attention to what goes on in the house. But he's not saying that he lives there. As a matter of fact, saying that my eyes and my heart are there is really an indication that he's not there. Okay? As for you, if you will walk before me as David your father walked with integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and keeping my statutes and my ordinances, then I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised your father David, saying, there shall not fail you a successor on the throne of Israel. Okay, what we have here is some spin, because David did not walk in the statutes of the Lord, okay? And he did not set a good example. In fact, he was such a lousy example that God wouldn't let him build the temple. You're not going to build my holy house. You are such a creep. So that's kind of what's going on here. So what you have here is what we call a royal spin. Okay? And what he is doing is he is legitimizing both his reign and the reign of whoever his successor might be that comes from his lineage. So that's what he's trying to establish, okay? Okay, well, there's more to that, and we'll get into it as we get down into this thing. This is the warning, and Remember now, this is written by people who are in exile in Babylon. If you turn aside from following me, you or your children, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes that I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land that I have given them, and the house that I have consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight, and Israel will become a proverb and a taunt among all peoples. This house will become a heap of ruins, which it did, okay? Everyone passing, which it did twice, by the way, everyone passing by it will be astonished and will hiss, and they will say, why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this house? Then they will say, because they have forsaken the Lord their God, who brought their ancestors out of the land of Egypt, and embraced other gods, worshiping them and serving them. Therefore the Lord has brought this disaster upon them. Okay, let's go back to an earlier part of the paragraph. He says, if you turn aside, and your children, okay? So the fate of Israel is tied directly to the king's behavior. And as we go through 1st, 2nd Kings and into Chronicles, you'll see that the people are held account for kings, for the behavior of kings that brings them into paganism. Okay? So beware, just because you have a bad leader doesn't excuse your behavior. That's what God is saying. But the people of Israel, especially these who are in exile, if they want to blame someone for their exile, they turn primarily to who the monarch was that violated God's laws. At the end of 20 years in which Solomon had built the two houses, the house of the Lord and the king's house, King Hiram of Tyre, having supplied Solomon with cedar and cypress, timber and gold, as much as he desired, King Solomon gave to Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. Now he's giving the Phoenician king, who is a pagan, land that was promised to Israel. So right away you see he's violating the territorial integrity of God's promised land. But when Hiram came from Tyre to see the cities that Solomon had given him, they did not please him. Therefore he said, what kind of cities are these that you've given me, my brother? So they are called the land of Kabul to this day. The land of Kabul, what does that mean? It means the land of I got snookered. Okay, so here Solomon is supposed to have such a great and wonderful relationship with Hiram, king of Tyre, and he sells the promised land. Hiram had sent to the king 120 talents of gold. So basically, Solomon gave him a pig in a poke, or sold him a pig in a poke, and Hiram wasn't happy with that deal. Why is that in there? Why is it showing that Solomon did this? It shows that he outsmarted the pagan. That's the point they're trying to make. That Solomon was wiser than Hiram. So he's a really smart king. Remember early on in this study I said what Solomon did was he took the gift of God, which was wisdom, and turned it into shrewd. And that's what we see here. Okay? Because there is in the Deuteronomic law a requirement that just because somebody is a foreigner, you do not cheat them. Okay? That's part of the Deuteronomic law, and Solomon cheated Hiram. This is the account of the forced labor that King Solomon conscripted to build the house of the Lord and his own house, the Milo and the wall of Jerusalem, Hazor, Megiddo. By the way, Megiddo was an incredible fortress. It was the last bastion to fall before the Romans back in the revolt of AD 70. Gezer. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up and captured Gezer and burned it down. He had killed the Canaanites who lived in the city and had given it as a dowry to his daughter, Solomon's wife. Okay, this is a great dowry. He captures a place, he kills everybody in it, and he burns the place down. This is my wedding gift to my son-in-law. I'll tell you what, not a good gift. So, Solomon rebuilt Gezer, Lower Beth Horon, Baalath, Tamar in the wilderness within the land, as well as all of Solomon's storage cities, the cities for his chariots, the cities for his cavalry, and whatever Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, and in all the land of his dominion. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that Solomon is not just focusing on building projects within Jerusalem, like the palace and the temple and the walls and things like that. Solomon is actually building fortified bastions throughout his kingdom, especially around the periphery. So these areas down in the south are the most vulnerable to invasion by Egypt. But he's also doing it up in Lebanon, in case Hiram gets a little bit too upset with him. So all through the land he has these, and one of the things that you might note is that when Herod became king, he reinforced this. He made all kinds of defensive positions and built on what Solomon did, so that his strongholds were really even more magnificent than Solomon's. All the people who were left out of the Amorites, the Hittites, and the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, who were not of the people of Israel, their descendants who were still in the land, whom the Israelites were unable to destroy completely, these Solomon conscripted for slave labor, so they are to this day. All right, so what's going on here? Solomon is doing the same thing that Saul was condemned for. By the edict of God, all of these people were supposed to be annihilated. Solomon did not annihilate them. Okay, neither did David, for that matter. But instead, he constricted them for slave labor, and it almost looks like he's being generous with them. But they're turned into slaves. Now, what's going on here? What's going on is that you have within your territory a number of peoples who are hostile to you and who resent you. Okay? During the antebellum period here in this country, one of the most terrifying things that anyone could think about was a slave rebellion. And so that's why the response to John Brown and to Nat Turner and to other slave rebellions down in Charleston were so brutal and intense, because this was, people knew that they were doing wrong by somebody else. And they knew if they ever had the power to get back at them, they'd unleash hell on them. And 20% of the Union Army were former slaves. It scared them. But of the Israelites, Solomon made no slaves. Oh, yeah, right. They were the soldiers, they were the officials, his commanders, his captains, and the commanders of his chariotry and cavalry. That sounds really nice, okay, but it's not true in general, because of the northern tribes, Solomon required them to spend 4 months out of the year as conscripted labor, working up with Hiram, cutting down trees, cutting stone, and doing all that sort of thing. So while he didn't call them slaves, they were not chattel slaves, as were the other people, to be bought and sold, okay? Solomon conscripted them so that they were like draft labor, okay? Now, I was drafted, okay? I don't know, were you around during the draft? That was after your time. Or before your time. Yeah, before. Well, so you did the Navy. You got the letter. Okay, I got the letter. Once you got the letter, you didn't get a choice, okay? And talking about conscripted labor, my monthly salary, because I had a wife and son, was $110 a month. Now we have an all-volunteer army, and guess what? They pay them a lot better. All right, these were the chief officers who were over Solomon's work, 550 who had the charge of the people who carried out the work. But Pharaoh's daughter, I love this part, but Pharaoh's daughter went up from the city of David to her own house that Solomon had built for her. Then he built the Milo. Okay, so what's happened? Pharaoh's daughter is married to Solomon, but she's living somewhere else. Okay, probably because Solomon's house is too full of other wives. Makes sense to me. 3 times a year, Solomon used to offer up burnt offerings and sacrifices of well-being on the altar that he built for the Lord, offering incense before the Lord. So he completed the house. Okay, these rituals that Solomon participates in 3 times a year, by Deuteronomic law, he was supposed to do that. So if you want to look at something that he was doing right, this is what he was doing right. Of course, every time he went up to sacrifice, he was endearing himself to the people because, you know, they got a good meal out of it, and it was a big high holy day, and it was all fun, and, you know, and this is what was going on with Solomon. So he reminds me a little bit of Al Capone, who took care of his neighborhood really well. All right. King Solomon, now this is really interesting, okay? King Solomon built a fleet of ships at Ezion-Geber, which is near Elot, on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. Now this is down south. This is the furthest southern point of Israel, and it's the port of Eilat today. It's right on the Red Sea. It means that Israel has access to the Mediterranean and to the Red Sea at this little pointy place down at the bottom of Israel. So Solomon has a port there as well, and he's building ships for a fleet, okay? Hiram sent his servants with the fleet, sailors who were familiar with the sea, together with servants of Solomon. They went to Ophir and imported from there 420 talents of gold, which they delivered to King Solomon. All right, where are they going? What's going on with this joint venture? Jews were not noted for their seafaring capabilities, okay? In the Genesis story, there is, it starts out with, in the beginning, the earth was without form and void. It was chaos, and darkness was on the face of the deep. So in the beginning, when God began to create, there was an earth, and it was watery, and it was kind of like a glob of water just floating around. If you ever see pictures of the space station, and every once in a while the astronauts will float some water, and it'll be like a bubble floating around there, and they'll suck out of that thing, and you know, it's kind of interesting to see what happens when it's weightless. But that's what they're describing the earth as being when God began to create. So, the sea has always been associated with chaos, okay? There has been a tie-in between what is evil and the monsters of the deep. And the Israelites, who were inland people, had a fear of the sea. So for him to have seafaring people, he's got to get them trained. So he enlists Hiram, who is a Phoenician, and the Phoenicians are probably the best seafaring trading nation in the world at that time. And so he gets skilled sailors from Hiram, and they do this joint venture, and they go around to Ethiopia. And in Ethiopia, they do some deals. Now, we look at Ethiopia today, and we say, oh, those people are all starving, and you know, and they are. It's a bad place right now. But back then, it was one of the wonders of the world. It was a seat of high knowledge. It was a very lucrative trading area. People wanted to get to Ethiopia because that's where spices and gold, evidently, all kinds of things. Now, I don't know what they were trading for the gold. Israelites were primarily agricultural, so I don't know what kind of finished goods they could have offered the Ethiopians. Maybe they just offered them food and had them pay in gold. That could happen too, okay? Because sometimes that part of Africa especially gets pretty arid, and they may not have been able to have good crops, so they may have taken advantage of a famine, gone down there and gotten some gold. Okay, but this is a joint venture, and what it means is that he's taking his people and putting them into a situation which is generally out of character for them, okay? When the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon, fame due to the name of the Lord, okay, she came to test him with hard questions. She came to Jerusalem with a very great retinue, with camels bearing spices and very much gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, She told him all that was on her mind. Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing hidden from the king that he could not explain to her. When the queen of Sheba had observed all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food at his table, the seating of his officials and the attendance of the servants, their clothing, his valets, his burnt offering that he offered at the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. And another translation for that, I think in the NIV, is she was breathless. Okay? Shazam. She was blown away. She was like some groupie at a rock star concert. Oh man, too much. Okay, so anyway, she's singing his praises. She said to the king, "The report was true that I heard in my own land of your accomplishments, of your wisdom, but I did not believe the reports until I came with my own eye, and my own eyes had seen it. Not even half had been told me. Your wisdom and prosperity far surpassed the report that I had heard. Happy are your wives, happy are these your servants who continually attend and hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and set you on the throne of Israel, because the Lord loved Israel forever. He has made you king to execute justice and righteousness." Then she gave the king 120 talents of gold, a great quantity of spices and precious stones. Never again did spices come in such quantity as that which the queen of Sheba gave to Solomon. All right. So we've heard about the queen of Sheba. She was one rich lady. Okay? And she was incredibly impressed with the king. And apparently the king was also impressed with her. Not only because she said nice things, but there must be something else about her. Moreover, the fleet of Hiram, which carried gold from Ophir, brought from Ophir a great quantity of almug wood, which I have no idea what almug wood is, okay? But it must have been really cool stuff. All right, they just lumbered along with it. And precious stones. From the almug wood, the king made supports for the house of the Lord and for the king's house. I wonder which ones went in first. Lyres also and harps for the singers. No such almug wood has come or been seen to this day. I looked through the commentary and he couldn't tell me what almug wood was. Anyway, I'll Google it. All right, here's a little, just a sentence thrown in, okay? Just minor point, little thing. Meanwhile, King Solomon gave to the queen of Sheba every desire that she expressed, as well as what he gave her out of Solomon's royal bounty. Then she returned to her own land with her servants. How about that? Isn't that nice? Okay, let me tell you what King Solomon gave to the queen of Sheba. A son. I mean, it was her desire, evidently. So, anyway, now what is the implication? Okay, the implication is this. A person's religion in the Jewish context comes from the mother, okay? But here, she goes back and has a child by Solomon. That's her claim. She names him as the baby daddy, okay? So she adopts Judaism as the religion of her land. Now, swing it forward to the 20th century, okay? There is much going on with Arab incursions and Muslim incursions in North Africa. And the people who are Ethiopian Jews, who are black, live under threat of Muslim persecution. Israel goes to Ethiopia and rescues these Jewish Ethiopians and brings them to Israel under the same statutes that Israel accepts every Jew from all over the world. So the acknowledgement in modern-day Israel is that these are the legitimate children of Solomon and that they are Jewish, even though they don't look Jewish, okay? But they are brought into Israel as part of God's chosen people. So what happened between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba has implications even for the modern day world. All right, the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold. That's a lot of gold. Besides which, that which came from the traders and from the business of the merchants and from the kings of Arabia and the governors of the land. King Solomon had made 200 large shields of beaten gold. 600 shekels of gold went into each large shield. He made 300 shields of beaten gold. That's a lot of shields, a lot of gold. 3 minas of gold, which I don't know what that is, went into each shield, and the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. What is the house of the forest of Lebanon? Anybody know what the house of the forest of Lebanon was? We had it in previous chapters. How soon we forget. That is Solomon's palace. I don't know, have any of you been to Williamsburg and gone through the historic area of Williamsburg? No? Oh, what is it? Thank you. I'm glad somebody did. Okay. If you have not gone, shame on you. Okay, you should go there and learn stuff because it's fantastic. Even if you're not a history buff, that's a good place to go. So if you go into the governor's palace, the first thing that you see when you come in the door are hundreds of weapons on the walls. Hundreds. Muskets, swords, pikes, all up there, beautifully arranged in the vestibule and throughout the downstairs area of the governor's palace. What is the governor trying to say? By having all these weapons around. I mean, some of us are lucky to have a gun cabinet, right? What? Don't mess with me. This is power. This is power. Why is Solomon putting up these shields of gold? If you can have a shield of gold, then gold is just a common thing that we make shields out of. We're that good. Okay? He's demonstrating his wealth, but he's also demonstrating that you don't mess with them. These are weapons. Okay? Forest 11. The king also made a great ivory throne and overlaid it with the finest gold. The throne had 6 steps. The top of the throne was rounded on the back, and on each side of the seat were armrests and 2 lions beside the armrest, while 12 lions were standing, one on each end of the steps. Nothing like it was ever made in any kingdom. Oops. All of Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None were of silver. This was not considered as anything in the days, not considered as anything, it's just gold, as anything in the days of Solomon. For the king had a fleet of ships at Tarshish at sea with a fleet of Hiram. So he and Hiram have now joined forces. And I have to suspect that this is not just a merchant fleet, okay? Because piracy was an issue. And so I'm sure that they had joint ventures, military ventures in the Mediterranean and in the Red Sea. Once every 3 years, the fleet of ships of Tarshish used to come bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. In the NIV, he's bringing apes and baboons. There is a word in there in Hebrew that nobody knows how to translate, so they just picked animals. Okay. Thus King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom. The whole earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put into his mind. Every one of them brought a present, objects of silver and gold, garments, weaponry, spices, horses, and mules, so much year by year. Solomon gathered together chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses. That's a lot, okay? And for those days, remember, if you go back to the old battles in the book of Judges, okay, everybody and their brother had chariots except the Israelites. Now the Israelites have chariots to challenge anyone who wants to invade their territory. Okay, he stationed them in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. So he had chariots all over the place, north and south. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones. I don't think anybody was allowed to just pick up stones. And he made cedars as numerous as the sycamores of Shephelah. Solomon's imports of horses, this is cool. Solomon's imports of horses was from Egypt and Kui, and the king's traders received them from Kui at a price. A chariot could be imported from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, and a horse for 150. So through the king's traders, they were exporting to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Aram. This is really funny, okay? One of the things that archaeologists have discovered is that the Egyptians were great chariot makers. Their chariots were not big, massive things, but they were fast. They were two-horse chariots, and they were fast. And they had an assembly line. They predated Henry Ford by thousands of years because they would turn chariots off on an assembly line. They actually invented that. And they turned them out fast. And the two big chariot nations historically were the Egyptians and the Hittites up in Turkey, okay? And the Hittites and the Egyptians were traditional rivals. They had huge battles under Ramses way, way back before the time of Moses. And so this was, the battles that are supposed to take place in Megiddo are basically chariot battles that people envision in apocalyptic literature. But he's taking Egyptian chariots and selling them to the Hittites. So he's like a new car dealer or an arms dealer. He's an arms dealer is what he is. And he's taking Egyptian chariots, selling them to the Hittites up north. So what we're seeing from this is that Egypt is not transporting its chariots through Israel. This gives you an idea that Israel, along the coastline, is the most beneficial trade route along the Med to get from Africa up to Europe, okay? So Solomon is getting rich because he is at the choke point. If you go too far east, you're in the middle of the desert. That's hard trekking, okay? So if you're going to have a good trade route with cities, with food along the way, with water along the way, you're going to go through the coastal regions of Israel. And what Solomon is doing is he is absolutely controlling the trade north and south going along that route. He's not producing the stuff that's traded except maybe for food that they grow in Israel, but he is managing the flow and he's taking a toll. And this is how Israel is getting rich. They're getting rich from the trade route that Solomon is managing, okay? So he's telling Egypt, well, you can't really transport your chariots through here. We'll buy them from you, okay? And then we'll sell them to the Hittites. And the price that we give you will negate whatever transportation costs you might have had, okay? So, he's wheeling and dealing. And that's one of the reasons why people think he is so wise, is because he is able to manipulate the economy in that region, okay? The wisdom of Solomon is primarily rooted in his wealth. If he wasn't wealthy, nobody would think he was smart. All right? Of course, they've had some smart people before, but they weren't rich. All right, any questions about what we've covered tonight? Very good. Well, yes. Oh, album wood, yes. Oh, that's really good stuff. Yeah, sandalwood. Beautiful. Okay. Thank you. Any others researching me? Do it. All right, let's have a prayer. Father, we do thank you for all your blessings and for these wonderful stories that come to us from Solomon. it's important for us to understand how the wisdom of Solomon works, because we think of the wisdom of Solomon strictly in terms of what he did in Proverbs and some of the judgments that he pronounced and that sort of thing. But the wisdom of Solomon was really mostly economic and military. And we pray that you would help us to understand that a strong economy means that you can develop a good defensive system for your country. And when your country does not have a good economy, you end up like ancient Israel, invaded by Philistines and Canaanites and all the rest. So help us, Father, to take a lesson from that, to be a nation that is strong, and as Israel was supposed to be good. For we ask it in Christ's name. Amen. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I look forward to seeing you Sunday morning, 11 o'clock.